That's a particular scene in the battlefield. What is interesting about this, something I would like to make very clear, is that we tend to think of Muslims and Hindus as entirely separate. I think that's entirely wrong. You have, in this particular fort, Muslims actually, you have two Rator commanders, but you have the best shot in the fort is a Muslim. There's a nice story about Akbar.
So this is a quote from the book by Mohamed Nasr called Classic Ships of Islam from Mesopotamia. It says, the streets of Basra, for example, were thronged with Persians, Arabians, Indians, East Africans, and Malay speakers from Indonesia. Along the Persian Gulf, the broad distribution of the population during the Caliphate was, as it seems, predominantly Arabian and Persian, but there were also minorities of East Africans, Indians, and others. The Arabian element retained its language, though intermarriages with Persians, Indians, East Africans, and also Southeast Asians were common, so that the descendants of the Peninsular Arabians might have often retained their language and have changed their type. Non-Arabians living on the peninsula would have a culture to Islam, and they might have adopted Arabic as a second language. This was probably the socio-cultural and political scenario. The common factors was the Islamic community, the Ummah, to which every Muslim belonged. Therefore, the concept of Muslim within the Ummah was a true identity, which meant equality irrespective of language, race, and religion. At least, this was the principle. So far, I have used the word Arabian, which stands for Arab and Arabian. Why have I done this? Firstly, the word Arab is a loose and broad term. It implies, though not always, someone speaking Arabic, a Muslim, Christian, or Jew. Someone living in an Arabic-speaking country from Morocco to Mesopotamia. An Arabian, on the other hand, is an inhabitant of the Arabian Peninsula, from the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf. One who speaks Arabic and or one or more Semitic languages, particularly those of southern Arabia. Consider that before and after the coming of Islam, many Arabians were not Muslims but Christians, Jews, and pagans. Alongside those living on the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, there was a large immigrant population from Persia, India, and East Africa, who had settled in the main port towns. There are Arabians and non-Arabians with whom this book is concerned, hence my usage of Arabian throughout the book. Secondly, the word Muslim was applied to all those who embrace Islam but not necessarily speak Arabic or acculturate to a Arabian identity. Persians are a good example of this. So that was page 34. Now we're looking at page 36. The distinction as shown is important. It raises the question of ethnic identity, Persian versus Arabian. Arabic sources talk specifically about Peninsula Arabians if they are discussing desert tribes that settled in the newly established towns, but in general, the tendency was to label as Muslim those foreigners who converted to Islam, irrespective of their ethnic background. In religious and administrative terms, the coined word Muslim is correct, but we are also in the dark as far as the ethnic background is concerned. Persians had converted in masses, though it seemed to be said that these Persians, who were mostly Zoroastrians prior to Islam, were affiliated to Arabian tribes. Some were monolingual, others bilingual. So Muslims too is a loose term, as was Arabs, for anyone who speaks Arabic but neither say much about the ethnic background, let alone that of the Persian-Arabian mix. When authors wrote of Muslim ships sailing in Southwest Asia, we are not sure what they meant. Are they talking about Muslim ships manned by Arabic-speaking Persians or Persian-speaking Arabs? So here we have page 37. We notice that although the word Muslim applied to the North African, East African, Indian, Persian, Yemenite, when it came to the Ottoman Turks, they did not refer to them as Muslims, but preferred that they were called Atrak, Turks. The Portuguese, according to the Hadrami Chronicles, were the Franks, a coined term remnant of the Latin chronicles of the Crusades, although with no exception, Muslim chronicles of the Crusades called Christians Franks, for whom the Arabic term was Ifrangi, ultimately meaning a foreigner. The 16th century Portuguese and thereafter the indigenous were classified into Caffres and Moors, both generic terms to indicate pagans and Muslims respectively. In simple terms, East Africa was the land of Caffres and Arabia the land of Moors. For the Portuguese, the use of the terms kafir simply means a black person, a word borrowed from the Arabs of the Atlantic coast and those of the Mediterranean, but with a different connotation, for they called the heathen Christian and Jews kafir, unbelievers. In the case of the Indian Ocean, kufar was a coined term used by Arabians for pagans, referring to non-Muslim blacks, while the Portuguese Christians and Jews or other Europeans were known as Franks. But kufar was also applied as a derogatory term addressed to Europeans. So that's an interesting paragraph. So, one, they refer to black people, or they refer to everybody on the Atlantic coast as a black person. Remember, this is the people of the Indian Ocean, so they're on the other coast, which we see here in this map. So we're talking about the Indian Ocean. So you have the East Africans, the Indians, there's Arabia in the middle, which is Africa, East Africa, all the way down to, was that New Zealand? The Papua New Guinea, which is now called all those islands. So this is the Indian Ocean. We're talking about the Arabs, Muslims, Arabians, Muslims, and all the people there, right? So if you're on the other side of Africa and all the way up into the Iberian Peninsula, they called you a black person, and including some of the southerns over there, the southern Italy, Greece, and so on. Unless you were, which he says is a derogatory term, was an Arab term then, it was still a derogatory term. It says unless you were a Christian, unless you were a Christian or a Jew, which they just called you an unbeliever, or what was it? Or a Frank, the Franks, the unbelievers. So the believers were the black over the other side, not from the Indian Ocean, were the blacks. Or the unbelievers were the Franks. Still, all being derogatory terms. Now, this is from page 38. The Portuguese called the Muslim a Moor, a name that belonged to a Mediterranean Atlantic coinage. The Portuguese called the Muslim a Moor, a name which belonged to a Mediterranean Atlantic coinage. This was a convenient name the Portuguese used, which encompassed any Indian Ocean native who was a Muslim, irrespective of his or her ethnic background, and therefore it could be an Arabian, East African, Indian, Persian, Javanese, Sumatran. Both of those are Indonesians nowadays, called Indonesians. But in fact, we know the chronicler Diogo that many from Kerala, India, for example, were Christians. Because of its extensive use in the Portuguese chronicles, the word Moor became a fashionable term among both the populace and European writers, evidenced by its occurrence later in the Dutch and English documents. So, to the Arabs, the land of the Moors was Arabia, but they acknowledged that there was Moors outside of Arabia, which they called Kafirs. But to the other people in those lands, the Franks, who weren't Moors in those lands, they called them Moors. The Kafirs, the Moors. As a matter of fact, they wound up calling everyone who wasn't a Frank or a Moor. Here's another book. The book in the Islamic world, the written word and communication in the Middle East, by George Atiyah. So this book is about the actual practice of writing books in the Arabic lands, in Arabia, I guess. There is indeed a great need to look into the role of the book in the development of the Islamic world and its culture. The history of the book, not only as an artifact, but also in terms of intellectual content and physical properties, need to be seriously explored. And investigation into the creation, manufacture, and use of the book in its written and printed forms have not been systematically approached. although there have been several attempts to do so. The kinship between the book and civilization is obvious yet understudied. Investigating it, as far as the Islamic world is concerned, can offer many insights into the nature and characteristics of that world. The term Islamic world should be clarified. We do not mean by it the Ummah, or community of believers. Rather, the countries that became mostly Muslim by religion and contributed to the growth and characterization of the widely spread Islamic civilization. The essays and studies of the present volume are, however, concerned only with what might be called the core of the Islamic world, namely the Middle East. So basically, they're speaking on all the countries at whichever point in time or another that had Muslim or Arabian influence. And as we just learned, Muslim, Arabian, Islamic are very Moorish, are very broad terms encompassing a lot. No particular set of people, no particular language, no particular religion, no particular culture. Maybe culture. Maybe culture. Well, as I did a video before about the Sundance and how the Sundance is a link of to the Islamic world. It is the remnants of the Islamic world that still exists today everywhere in the world. The Sundance. So we're talking about a grand culture that contributed to this great civilization, this great empire that existed before it fell. And it didn't fall to conquest. It fell to infighting, which is still going on today. But specifically, it fell because of the harems. Because you had these kings, you had so many kings, and they are converting this people next to them. But they had these harems in which they had thousands of princes. Thousands of princes. So, what is it? King Solomon had how many wives, right? Of different religions, different gods. That's a story of these sultans who had thousands of princes, each wanting to be the next sultan. And there's yet so many kingdoms that exist and have all these people competing to be the next king. And that's what destroyed the empire. They were all killing each other. Until a few of them decided to ally up with the Franks, which they are still allied with them today, and try to keep at bay the growth of the Islamic world.